I understand it's a topic that it's troubling a lot of people, and especially the issue of war. But we will look at it more broadly. We will look at the issue of violence in the Old Testament and the issue of war. So we will start basically with violence, and we will move gradually into the issues of war. When did this interest start? It was basically in the last 2 decades that people were more and more interested in this topic, and especially after the collapse of the Twin Towers on 9/11/2001 in the US, and the prominence of the Islamic Jihad in the global awareness. So people began to observe now how religious language was associated with terrorist attacks and also with related wars that came as a response to these attacks. And people concluded that it is religions that destroy our world. So it is religions, they say, that are the cause of these wars. And you may be aware of the Neo-Atheist Movement. So Neo-Atheists especially are the ones who claimed that it was not just Allah of the Quran that posed a problem for the peace of our world, but also Yahweh of the Old Testament, of the Jewish and the Christian tradition. So both of these figures and both of the religious texts, the Quran and the Bible, promote an image of divinely authorized war. So they are equally dangerous, and they should therefore be rejected, both of them. Is it true, though, that religion promotes violence? Various answers have been offered by historians and sociologists who have shown that the same degree of violence may be observed in non-religious communities just as well. So according to some people, there could be up to 20 million victims of violence under Stalin's atheistic regime alone. So you see, it's really a myth that only the religiously driven people or leaders or ideologies produce violence. The theologian William T. Kavanaugh, I will be showing some books for you if you want to study these issues further. So this is a very important theologian, William Kavanaugh, who has managed to debunk the myth that religion is to be blamed for violence, whereas a secular world is the only answer for peace. In fact, he shows that the divide between the religious and the secular is an artificial divide. It's never really in reality been divided. Also, we have studies from an anthropological perspective. An anthropological perspective has also examined the issue of violence and has come up with some conclusions. And I want to mention here the basic ideas of René Girard. You may know this thinker, and I think that his ideas continue to be valid. Basically, he has demonstrated how in various cultures, religion does not produce violence, but it is the mechanism of restricting and resolving the existing violence that exists in each community. Also, the famous psychiatrist Carl Jung, he also has already discussed how communal gatherings, religious gatherings for worship, were indeed a mechanism in the community of limiting violence and transforming it into safe expressions. Some scholars claim this and observe this in the imprecatory psalms. You know, the imprecatory psalms who are speaking of vengeance and with hatred and all this. One look, if you take a look at the social media today, if you take a look at Facebook, it is enough to show us how much hate speech it's thrown around from one individual against the other. And one could be tempted to consider the imprecatory Psalms as doing something similar with their curses and their rage against the enemy. But they are not similar, despite the fact that they make us feel very uncomfortable when we read them. Imprecatory Psalms make up the 5% of the Psalter. They are the harshest, most raw form of human lament one could encounter. But behind these angry words, one is able to discern the unbearable suffering of the psalmist. His or her sense of justice that has been violated. So let's not just look at the curses, the hatred, and these feelings of vengeance. Let's look behind it to see that something has been violated. The psalmist has a strong sense of justice in him, and because it's violated, he's objecting, he's opposing. Let's consider an example of this. It's Psalm 109. 7 to 10. When he's tried, let him be found guilty. Let his prayer be counted as sin. May his days be few. May another seize his position. May his children be orphans and his wife a widow. May his children wander about and beg. May they be driven out of the ruins they inhabit. This is a very strong psalm. It's very hard to read it. Lisa Ray Beale, she's an Old Testament scholar, and she says that all the terrible things we wish against our enemies must be honestly acknowledged in prayer. So this is precisely what the psalmist is doing. We don't have to keep these strong feelings of hatred we have just in the streets or in the hallways. We are thinking about them anyway. They are in our hearts, these feelings. But she says that honest acknowledgement in prayer of what God already knows that we think is a route to removing such violence from our hearts. So, however, the most important part when we reflect on these Psalms or when we acknowledge violent thoughts in prayer is that this practice hands vengeance over to God rather than leaving it into our own hands. So it has to come before the Lord. It has to come into our prayers. Yes, of course we will move on to forgiveness. Of course we will move on to thanksgiving, but we cannot skip lament. We cannot skip the injustice that we are feeling. We must acknowledge injustice, acknowledge our anger and vengeful feelings in us. So as we can see, religion is not the source of violence, but may offer ways of managing violence or even containing it through practices such as acknowledging our violent tendencies in our prayer. But I will not get into these debates now of the cause of violence. We have a war to fight, right? So, but before focusing on the issue of war in the Old Testament, I would like to show how the greatest part of the Bible is made up of literature that resists the metaphysically or divinely endorsed violence. We need a context and we need definitions before we answer questions or even before we ask questions. Many come to me every time with an urgent question, asking, tell me, yes or no, does God command a genocide? And to me, this question sounds like, tell me, yes or no, does water kill you? Well, no, if certain conditions are in place, and yes, if certain conditions are in place. So you see, my answer depends on whether the person is asking about water killing us by drinking, by diving into it, by rain flood, by traces of it in our lungs. Is the question about seawater or river water? You see, the question is not enough unless you understand every term of the question and to which conditions we are referring. So, for this reason, if we begin with war texts, we will have a distorted view of the Bible because, in fact, the majority of texts resist violence or restrict it. It is important, first of all, to feel the weight of the biblical stance against violence so that the war texts may then be placed in their proper perspective and proper understanding. I want to begin with the beginning, stories of beginnings. They are very important, and every book you read, you should read the prologue. You should read how it starts, because the beginning of texts will guide you and will give you a lens on how to proceed reading the entire text. So let's begin with these stories, from the story of creation. Beginning with the story of creation, but also from the writings of the prophets later on, and even in the laws of Israel, we can see a polemic against violence. But the Bible, of course, is not a Zen book. What do I mean by Zen book? By Zen, I mean that it does not give us any techniques or mental exercises that will help us escape or deny the phenomenon of violence. It's quite the opposite, actually. It is a book that acknowledges deeply, as we saw in the Psalms, it acknowledges deeply the violent tendencies of humans. It understands them, but it guides these urges beyond themselves. So it calls humanity to transcend itself and its violent instincts. Let's begin by looking at some biblical examples of resistance to divinely endorsed violence. A significant departure of the Bible from the metaphysically justified violence begins with the story of creation. As you know, in ancient Mesopotamia and in other places of the world, there are creation stories. There are stories of beginnings. Specifically in Mesopotamia, the world is said to be created as a result of a theomachy. Theomachy means the battle of the gods. Theos is God and machi is battle. But we see in the Babylonian, for example, the Babylonian creation myth, it's called Enuma Elish. We see the powers of chaos come against the powers of order, and in this confrontation, the gods of order prevail, led by their leader, the god Marduk. So the victorious Marduk, after this theomachy, he undertakes the creation of the world, using as his raw materials the remains of the carcass of the defeated god of chaos, Tiamat. So let's read a bit of the battle in Enuma Elish. Face to face they came, Tiamat and Marduk, sage of the gods. They engaged in combat. They closed for battle. The Lord, which is in this case Bel or Baal or Marduk, spread his net and made it encircle her. He shot an arrow which pierced her belly, split her down the middle and slit her heart, vanquished her and extinguished her life. The Lord trampled the lower part of Tiamat. With his unsparing mace, he smashed her skull. So you can see this confrontation, very brutal, very bloody confrontation of the gods in the beginnings of the Babylonian myth. Marduk, after engaging in this battle, then he acquires the right to create the world. Only after he has proven his military strength through war. Now he has gained the privilege of creating the world. So in this kind of world, the first principle of the cosmos, what is the first principle of the cosmos? The first principle is physical or military might, strength or power. This is the power behind creation. Who gets to defeat the other? Who has the most military power? And it's not only Babylonia, also in Greece we have this. We have the Theomachy battle of the Titans. the older gods of Greece against the Olympian gods, which is the younger generation, and whoever wins is the one who starts producing civilization and becomes the patron of cities and all of that. So theomachy is present in many cultures, including Egypt. Actually, you have the myth of Osiris murdered by his brother Set, for example, and so on. The gods are in battle. Now, this aspect is absent in the Old Testament. If theomachy means an actual confrontation between two opposing powers, where there is an actual possibility for any of these opposing powers to prevail, then this is completely unknown in the biblical world. We have, of course, depictions of Yahweh doing war, but this battle in equal terms, not knowing who will prevail from the two, does not exist in the Old Testament, in the biblical world. One can find in some poetic texts in the Bible, we can find God doing battle with Leviathan, for example, or other beasts of chaos that embody chaos. So let's have a look in Psalm 74. Yet God, my King, is from of old, working salvation in the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. So you see a battle being described here, but it's very different from the battle that we see in Enuma Elish, because these texts are exactly that. They are poetic texts. There's no actual danger envisaged in the Old Testament that some beasts will come and prevail over Yahweh. There's no real possibility in the mind of the readers that another God may end up prevailing over Yahweh. There's no threat of theomachy in the doctrine of biblical writers. The language is purely metaphorical, just as no reader of the book of Revelation would actually think that the beasts that are coming out of the sea are a real threat to Christ and may end up defeating him. No reader understands or reads the text this way with this anxiety. So it's the same in the Old Testament. And parenthetically now, we must remember this in the New Testament as well. Of course, there's better New Testament scholars here that can help us later in the discussion. But when we speak about Christ having defeated the devil and having subdued the powers and principalities under his feet, we must be very careful, because we're not referring to an actual theomachy here, but we are using metaphorical language to demonstrate the salvific achievements of the cross. So there was not a possibility somewhere there that Satan is an equal power to Christ and would have defeated him, but at the last minute Christ defeated Satan and now we're safe. No, there's not this understanding in the metaphorical language that we're using for battle. There is no battle between two equal gods. Even though we may describe concepts in warfare language, the enemy is always a tool in God's hands for his own purposes. Even the sea, as you know, it's a symbol of chaos in both the story of creation and in the story of the Red Sea, in the story of the Exodus from Egypt. But the sea is not an independent force, but it is a tool in the hands of God. He created the sea. You see now how the introduction of our book helps us have this perspective from the beginning. We know where the sea came from. He created the sea. He defined it. He named it. Genesis 1, 7 to 10. So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome, and it was so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And various texts in the Old Testament describe this ordering, this control, this sovereignty of God over the sea and the boundaries that he places. Job 38, for example, or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed bounds for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come, and no further, and here shall your proud waves be stopped. More text from Proverbs 8. He assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth. And Psalm 104:9, you set a boundary that they, the waters, may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. In the prophets too, Jeremiah 5:22, do you not fear me, says the Lord? Do you not tremble before me? I placed the sand as a boundary for the sea, a perpetual barrier that it cannot pass. Though the waves toss, they cannot prevail. Though they roar, they cannot pass over it. So there's no question that God is absolutely sovereign over the sea, over the chaos in the world. If God did not need to shed the blood of another in order to create, how is then the creation of the world presented by the biblical writers? It is presented without a hint of military violence or the presence of threatening chaotic forces, but instead it is founded on the Word, the Logos. The Word, the speech of God, is the element that creates, that gives life, that blesses, that names, that defines, which means he ethically evaluates everything that he creates in the world. So, in fact, this is the story we see in creation, the Word achieving all this, the Logos achieving all this, not any military strength. But if you think about it, this is achieved not only through the Word of God in creation, but at the same time with the word of the author who narrates to us what really happens in creation. He's creating something in us. He's creating the world which we inhabit. We were not there to see it, but the word of the author now is creating life in us. By the use of his pen, what does he do? He weakens ideologically the dominant religion of violence, which is grounded in texts of violence. And he is instead inviting his audience to a narrative of peace, of life, of order, of word, of speech. So the author doesn't need to take up arms and go and kill the Babylonians so that his story will prevail. No. He needs to tell his story and substitute in word the world, the reality that others created. This is how life happens. So, in other words, he proposes a different way of achieving order, peace, and rest in the world. The creation story then is not simply a story that exists to satisfy our curiosity of how the world began, even though it's approached many times with this understanding, but it promotes a completely different ideology. We see, therefore, how foundational this doctrine is from the first pages of the scriptures. And the first pages of the Bible are the intentions of God for humanity. By being put first in order, they invite us to enter the rest of the story of the Old Testament with these beginnings in mind, so that we may always compare what happens next in the story with where we started from. Where did we depart from? So we have always something to compare it to. We compare what ends up happening with what was initially intended by God. I wonder how much difference it makes in the Quran. the fact that it does not begin with the creation story and the intentions of God for humankind. From what I understand, information about the creation is scattered throughout the Quran, and it does not exist as a complete single story that launches the drama of humanity. So maybe this is a research to be done. How does it affect interpretation if these intentions of our God is not put first and help us to read how we departed from it? So how is the Israelite then supposed to prevail over the great empires of violence and over the religions that support them? By picking up their weapons and imitating those fighting gods in the theomachies, or with the logos, with the word of one's mouth, the same word through which the entire cosmos came into existence. Words of blessing are what brought about life and fertility and the way that multiplication began on earth. Now I would like you to see this icon of Christ with his word being a sword. That's his weapon, the word. At the same time, this same word is interpreted as a branch of peace. So you see, it does not let you interpret it in a military fashion. It is the word that's the sword, but it is a branch of peace at the same time. It is the word that conducts battle, and this concept of creation through word begins in the Old Testament. By the word of his mouth, he created everything that there is in the world. So how do people survive? How do people continue to be sustained in life throughout history? By the words of prayers that have the power of changing the mind and psychology of an entire people group and maintain their resilience in the most testing conditions, such as those of the exile of Israel. Who kept the people in the exile? Who kept the people expectant and resilient in a foreign land, patiently waiting for their return? How were they kept alive? Is it by weapons that they were kept alive? No, it was the words of the prophets. It was their psalms that kept them alive. The power of the word cannot be underestimated. Remember the famous exile psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows, there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. So you see the tragedy of this psalm is one of the most tragic psalms in the Bible because the singer laments about his inability to sing in a foreign land. And yet this is precisely what he's doing. He's singing in a foreign land. And he's pushing through to sing. And you can see that as he's pushing through to sing, even in the process of singing, in the course of singing this psalm, his psychology changes. His aspect, his viewpoint is changing as he remembers what he thinks about. You can see that the words of this psalm sustain him. They sustain him to remember Jerusalem. It is the word that fuels his survival, and it carries him and his entire community to go through the exile and to survive it with resilience until they see the return of the whole people to Jerusalem again. So we see it is not because they prevailed over the Babylonians that the Israelites survived. It is not even because they picked up their weapons in exile against their oppressors that they survived. It is because they used the Word of God as the weapon that shielded them from defeatism and guarded them against the enticement of the enemy's gods. They could very easily say, Marduk has won. Yahweh is dead. They could have interpreted this through theomahy, the theomahy principle, but they did not. They knew there's no theomahy for their God, so it cannot be that our God has failed. These words, the words of their prophets, of their psalms, of their stories, have sustained them against the enticement of the enemy's gods. And this reminds us of how St. Paul envisages the church's warfare for its survival. Note that the enemy, in the text we will see now, is word-related and has to do with ideas and beliefs. In 2 Corinthians 10, 3-5, indeed we live as human beings, but we do not wage war according to human standards. For the weapons of our warfare are not merely human, but they have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every proud obstacle raised up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ. So you see these word-related, thought-related, ideology-related battles here. But as we already saw, this idea does not begin with Paul. It begins already in creation. It is God, Yahweh, who introduces this idea. Creation by the word replaces creation through theomahy that would normally be expected. So we will see that even the wars that are narrated in the Bible, they are told by authors, by the authors of the scriptures, not in order to command their repetition, not in order to be imitated, but because they have a lesson to communicate. And in fact, they are told with the purpose of being restricted and placed in the distant past as unique events of the ancient days. But you have to be patient until we get there. Now, I want us to look at more anti-violence texts before we get to war. It's very important for us to read the Bible in its own context. Not only its ancient Near Eastern context, but also in its literary context. How does a story relate to what preceded and what follows in the story? Also, how is a story interpreted or viewed by the same book or by other books in the Old Testament? The way that other books in the Old Testament interpret a previous story will guide us on how to interpret it as well. So we may be reading a story of a battle or a story of rape, and with a naive way of reading, the kind of superficial reading that we observe in the books of the Neo-Atheists, we may conclude that the Bible, just because it is narrating a battle, that necessarily means that it's promoting violence and war. Most of the time, the writers are doing the exact opposite. For those of you who are film lovers, one could say this of the director Quentin Tarantino. I don't know how many of you watch him, but on a first viewing, one may think that there's so much blood in his movies. The sheer amount of blood and violence portrayed in his movies is praising and promoting violence. Okay, this is the first reading. However, the fact is that Tarantino, by this exaggeration, he aims at ridiculing violence and bloodshed. He's not promoting it. But superficial reading would arrive at that idea. So superficial readings of ancient texts will not help us. One of our examples is found in Genesis 34. We have the story here of Dinah's rape. In Genesis 34, we read the stories of Simeon and Levi and how their sister Dinah was raped by Shechem. Shechem acknowledged what he had done, and he wanted to make reparations for his offense by offering to marry Dinah. Her brothers, eager to defend the honor of their family, they agreed to the marriage and request that all the men of Shechem, they have to circumcise themselves, and then we will be able to come into a covenant with each other. We come to be related. Only this way can they be relatives, through marriage. And of course the men agree, but while the men of Shechem are recovering from an extremely painful procedure, the brothers of Dinah seize the opportunity, enter the town, they kill all the men, and take everything that belonged to them as loot. Now, by reading this story on its own, we could arrive at the conclusions that the scriptures are on the side of the Israelite brothers and that their violence was justified. Yes, they humiliated their sister. We could conclude that their ethical indignation is admirable and that their violence is endorsed. So let's say, okay, Genesis 34, Dinah's rape. If we read the story and we do not read to the very end of the book, we may conclude that the two brothers are the heroes of the story. But we have to keep reading to the end of the book, all the way to the blessing of Jacob, whose blessing is actually turning to a curse against them. We read in chapter 49, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. May I never come into their counsel. May I not be joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and at their whim they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it's fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So you can see it's not a very positive interpretation of what they have done by defending their sister. Moreover, the reader who is familiar with the law, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, and foot for foot in Exodus 21:24, is able to recognize immediately why this law was absolutely essential for Israel. It was there to prevent any type of punishment that would exceed the crime, just like the case that we saw with Simeon and Levi. In order to limit the uncontrollable shedding of blood that was common when families took the law in their hands with a vengeful spirit, as we have seen already in the Dinah story. Again, a naive look at this law, eye for an eye, would interpret it as a vengeful law, when in reality it exists to prevent precisely this uncontrollable vengefulness and limitless violence. Now, the death penalty was the norm in all the cultures of the ancient Near East, and so it was in Israel as well. But the death penalty in Israel was not something that was to be taken lightly. It was a terrifying responsibility. The biblical texts already sense the danger of abusing capital punishment. Nobody feels really comfortable with this law in the scriptures. What happens if there is a mistake and an innocent person is punished instead of the guilty one? What happens if someone accuses a person of murder without any evidence? What happens if it was just an accident and the death was not premeditated? What happens if the killing was self-defense? Is there perhaps a punishment equal to the death penalty that could be applied so that we may leave the final word to God Himself? This divine task of justice, this responsibility for the lives of others, was not taken lightly. God's people have been seeking ways of handling the difficult and sacred task of justice with much fear and trembling, lest they themselves become unjust. So in Israel, it was not very easy to have the death penalty implemented. Lots of restrictions were placed on it in order to avoid mistakes. For example, 2 or more witnesses were required in order to sentence someone to the death penalty. We read, "A single witness shall not suffice to convict a person of any crime or wrongdoing in connection with any offense that may be committed. Only on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses shall a charge be sustained." Also, the witnesses were the first ones to administer the execution of the death penalty, the ones to cast the first stone. The risk involved in false witnessing was enormous, since the law condemned false witnesses to the same penalty that they were attempting to bring on the innocent person they were targeting. Therefore, if the false witness brought an accusation against someone about a capital crime and the falsity of the witness was discovered, then the death penalty would be applied on the false witness instead. Deuteronomy 19, 17 to 19, "You shall do to the false witness just as the false witness had meant to do to the other." So you would not go very lightly to bring a false witness against your neighbor. You would understand the high risk and the high cost that this would have. So such restrictive stipulations would discourage to a great degree false witnessing, and therefore would hopefully limit the death penalty on innocent individuals. But even in the case of guilt, it will still not be easy to find 2 or 3 witnesses to capital crimes. These crimes usually happen in absolute secrecy. So how would you find 2 or 3 witnesses to an adultery, for example? The people who commit adultery will usually go and hide somewhere. So it was not very easy to implement this capital punishment. For the Old Testament, we must remember that it is a lesser evil for the guilty to go unpunished than for the innocent to be convicted. Because if you convict the innocent, you're perpetuating unjust violence on innocent parties. There's another law that exists to limit the possibility of such violence, and this is the existence of cities of refuge. Cities of refuge existed in the land of Israel. They were appointed in the land of Israel. And the instructions for the cities of refuge are given in Numbers 35, Deuteronomy 4, and 19. So when a person was killed in Israelite territory, it was customary for the family to take the responsibility of avenging the blood of their dead relative. Without the sober legal process and under the influence of uncontrollable fury, mistakes could easily be made, and the risk of shedding innocent blood was high. We saw that example already in the story of Dinah. Therefore, when the supposed murderer was threatened to be killed by the victim's family, he or she could run to the closest city of refuge, and the avenger was forbidden from entering to harm. This process now would give more time to the elders of the town to investigate, to intervene, to try the legal case, and issue the appropriate penalties. In this way, they secured that violence would be contained, would be restricted, and an analogous penalty that does not exceed the crime would be given in the case of guilt. Now, the right to asylum was guarded by the law, even for the lowest of slaves who might have experienced abuse in the hands of their masters. The reality of slavery, as you know, was widespread in the ancient world. But again, the Bible aimed at restricting the violence that a master might have exercised on his slave. In Deuteronomy 23, 15 to 16, This text essentially legislates the release of a slave, apart from the 7th year that was already customary for release, as we know from Exodus 21:2, but also earlier. If the case was that one's life was threatened by the master. And here, however, I believe it speaks of foreign slaves even, not of Israelite slaves, but how much more for Israelite slaves. It says, slaves who have escaped to you, and why would they escape to you? Because they're mistreated under their master. Slaves who have escaped to you from their owners shall not be given back to them. Because even the very act of escaping from your master is enough to tell us that there's something wrong. Don't give them back to the owner to resolve it. It's an asylum. Keep them. They shall reside with you in your midst, in any place they choose, in any of your towns, wherever they please. You shall not oppress them. Now take this to the grander scale of the refugee crisis we face today. How many people, how many countries send refugees back to the context of abuse? This is the law of our God. The running away of a person to find refuge with you is sacred. It's sacred. You're not allowed to send him back. So a law such as this one has the potential to transform slavery into a normal, respectful employment where employees may decide to abandon it when faced with situations where their rights are being denied or abused. This law is another law that is unique in the ancient Near East. It's not found anywhere else. And it aims at restricting violence by showing that asylum was sacred. And many more similar laws could be mentioned, but due to our time limits, we must leave it at that. I will have some more examples later. So we see, though, that legislation for determining the guilty party in a crime was becoming more and more and more strict, taking into consideration the location of the victimizer, the weapon that was used, whether the person acted out of self-defense, and the requirement for at least 2 or 3 witnesses for an accusation to stand, as we already mentioned. Finally, on the same topic of capital punishment, texts betray the possible replacement of the capital punishment with exile. This alternative may have been inspired by the way with which God himself in Genesis 4 handled the murderer Cain. Now, according to the law, when Cain kills Abel, capital punishment should have been imposed for the innocent blood of Abel, correct? Why doesn't God implement his own law? Instead of this, God exiles Cain in 4:12, providing some sort of asylum on his own body that forbids his killing, thus problematizing the handling of capital punishment for the readers of the story. They're wondering, why is God doing this? Why doesn't he implement capital punishment? Let's look at the text. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me." Then the Lord said, well, let's stop here. Why, he says, is anyone who meets me may kill me? Because no other nation has this law that when a fugitive comes to you, his asylum is sacred. He must stay with you. You must protect him and not send him back. No, the laws in the ancient Near East is if there's a fugitive coming to you, a fugitive slave, kill him. Okay? No questions asked. So Cain knows this very well. Then the Lord said to him, "Not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a 7-fold vengeance." And the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who came upon him would kill him. So he carried on himself some sort of symbol of asylum. We don't know exactly what that was. There's many speculations, but something that was visible and communicated a portable asylum. So you see that something happened here. There is a replacement of the capital punishment with exile by God himself. And we see in the texts of Israel, even the exile of Israel herself is often presented in the prophetic text as the appropriate punishment for the shedding of blood in their land, instead of the total annihilation of the people. Israel has shed innocent blood in their land. What is the appropriate punishment? Capital punishment. Annihilation. But what happens instead? Exile. Again, capital punishment is replaced by exile. Where is the life for life? Yes, God allows for exile to substitute for the death penalty. Moreover, by preaching now the return of the deported, okay, so capital punishment, there's no restoration, you're done. Exile looks to the future. There may be a slim hope of restoration for these people now. And indeed, we have texts that are preaching this to the exiles. They're preaching the return of the deported, and the prophets have promoted restoration as the end of punishment. So you see now, punishment is not vengeful. You did this, therefore you be punished, end of story, and it stops there. No, the punishment of God has an other end in mind. And this ideal could be regarded as the precursor of our modern understandings of imprisonment. It's not something that our modern minds came up with. It's already inspired from the scriptures. Our modern understandings of imprisonment, which is an internal exile within one's country, basically, it looks to the restoration and rehabilitation of the internally deported. Therefore, God's punishment has a goal. It's not revenge. It is not mere vengeance, but it looks to the rehabilitation, the restoration, the recreation of the people. Scholars have also noted how early Judaism was deeply uncomfortable with capital punishment. In the Mishnah, which is a proto-rabbinic work, we see rabbis discussing this topic. And rabbis express their opposition to capital punishment and state that a court, they say, that executes someone once in every 70 years is considered murderous. This is their wording. So not even one person should be executed every 70 years. Rabbinic Judaism placed lots of legal barriers, making such a sentence extremely difficult to carry out. So you can see that there is this tension in the Old Testament already, and in early Judaism. Now, biblical law takes all sorts of precautions to avoid violence in the family as well, in family relations as well.